The night did not begin with silence. It began with the kind of fear that arrives before the first explosion, when sirens cut through the darkness and people realize something far bigger is unfolding. In Tel Aviv, families rushed from their beds without fully waking, grabbing children, phones, and whatever they could carry in trembling hands. In Haifa, the same panic spread street by street as the sky above the city flashed with fire. This was no longer a distant threat discussed on television or debated by officials behind microphones. It was overhead, immediate, violent, and impossible to ignore. The sound of war was no longer coming from the border. It had entered the heart of daily life. What made the moment even more chilling was that the attack did not feel like a single act of retaliation. It felt like a message. Iran was not firing to make a symbolic point and then retreat into silence. It was showing that this confrontation had entered a new stage, one in which pressure would not be limited to one city, one target, or one dramatic headline. The missiles came in waves, drones followed, and reports of fresh launches kept surfacing while people were still trying to understand the damage from the last round. By the time one neighborhood had begun counting broken windows and burned vehicles, another was already hearing fresh warnings. For days, anger had been building inside Iran after the killing of top leaders in the earlier joint strikes. That shock had quickly turned into open fury. Tehran's tone hardened, its military posture changed, and the promise of a full response stopped sounding like rhetoric. Then the retaliation arrived with force. Tel Aviv was among the first places to feel it. Blasts were reported in key areas. Emergency teams rushed across damaged streets, and images of smoke rising over major districts spread rapidly across the region. But just when many believed Tel Aviv would remain the main focus, the conflict widened again. Haifa, the major northern port city known for its industrial weight and strategic value, also came under attack. That changed the emotional temperature of the war immediately. Haifa was not just another city on a map. It represented something deeper: trade, industry, shipping, military logistics, and the idea that northern Israel could also be dragged fully into the center of this escalation. Once Haifa came under fire, the pattern became clear. This was not merely punishment. It was an effort to demonstrate range, capability, and intent. Every missile that bypassed or overwhelmed defenses sent the same signal. No area could feel fully secure, and no one could confidently say the worst had already passed. Reports also intensified around attacks linked to Ben Gurion Airport. Even partial disruption around such a major hub carries enormous symbolic power. An airport is more than infrastructure. It is movement, connection, commerce, escape, and the illusion of normal life. When such a place is mentioned in the same breath as missiles and emergency alerts, people understand that the battlefield is no longer only military. The entire rhythm of a country starts to bend around the fear of what could be hit next. Yet Iran's offensive was only one side of the firestorm. Israel did not step back. Instead, retaliation accelerated. Strikes were reported in and around Tehran, with specific areas described as important security and military zones. The message from Israel and its allies appeared to be just as direct. If Iranian missiles could shake Israeli cities, then Iranian command centers, missile systems, and strategic networks would also be placed under relentless pressure. What emerged was not a sequence of separate attacks, but a brutal exchange that kept feeding itself. Every strike justified another. Every retaliation became the reason for the next one. That is why this conflict began to feel different from earlier rounds of tension. It was no longer operating under the old assumption that both sides would push just enough to look strong and then quietly pull back. This time, each phase seemed designed to erase the limits of the previous one. Tel Aviv burning led to Tehran being bombed harder. Tehran under fire led to more launches toward Israeli cities. The map of the war grew wider, and so did the emotional damage it created. In Israel, people found themselves caught between official reassurances and visible destruction. Missile defense systems remained active, interceptors filled the sky, and authorities tried to project control. But when even a small number of missiles break through, the psychological effect is enormous. People do not measure fear by percentages of successful interceptions. They measure it by shattered glass, burning cars, collapsed roofs, and the sight of neighbors covered in dust. Even those whose homes remain standing begin to live differently. They sleep in clothes. They keep emergency bags near the door. They stop trusting the ordinary routines that made life feel stable. In Iran, the experience was no less severe, only different in form. Airstrikes created their own terror. Families in urban districts waited through the night, fearing that the next explosion might land in a nearby street, a building next door, or a place known by name only hours earlier. The uncertainty became a weapon of its own. Unlike a battlefield with clear front lines, This kind of confrontation turns distance into an illusion. No one feels far away. No one feels certain they are outside the target zone. As the exchange intensified, another debate began surfacing among military observers. Some suggested that not every Iranian site destroyed in retaliatory strikes had been a critical operational asset. There were growing discussions that some installations may have been decoys, replicas, or false targets intentionally placed to absorb attacks and misdirect enemy planning. If true, that would mean the war was not only being fought with missiles and drones, but also with deception and patience. It would mean expensive attacks may have destroyed low-value targets, while real systems stayed concealed elsewhere, waiting for the next phase. That possibility added a new dimension to the conflict. Modern war is not always about who has the most firepower. It is often about who can force the other side to waste it. A missile worth millions can still be a strategic loss if it destroys an empty shell. A dramatic video of a target exploding means far less if the real capability was never there to begin with. That is why the public narrative of victory can become dangerously misleading. Governments present destroyed targets, celebrate successful operations, and frame events as proof of control. But on the ground, wars are not decided by headlines. They are decided by what survives after the cameras move on. And survival, in this war, increasingly seems to depend on endurance. Iran appears determined to show that it can sustain launches, rotate tactics, and keep pressure alive despite the punishment it is taking. Israel and its allies appear equally determined to strike deeper, harder, and more systematically in order to wear down that capacity over time. This creates a conflict of stamina as much as power. It is not just about who can hit harder tonight, it is about who can still operate after nights of hitting and being hit. That is also why comparisons to smaller conflicts miss the point. Iran is not an isolated pocket of fighters or a narrow strip of land with limited room to maneuver. It is a large state with depth, infrastructure, domestic military production, and a doctrine shaped by years of sanctions, regional proxy conflict, and strategic patience. That does not make it unstoppable, but it does mean that any military campaign against it is inherently more complex, more expensive, and more likely to drag on than many leaders publicly admit at the beginning. At the same time, Israel is not a passive target waiting for damage to accumulate. It has advanced defenses, experienced intelligence networks, and the ability to respond with precision and speed across long distances. That is what makes the confrontation so dangerous. Both sides can absorb pain and still strike back. Both sides believe backing down would look like weakness. Both sides appear locked into proving that the other cannot set the terms of the fight. Once that mindset takes hold, escalation becomes easier than restraint. The wider world watches with growing alarm because everyone understands what happens when a conflict like this slips beyond its original frame. Shipping routes can be threatened, oil markets can panic, neighboring countries can be pulled in by direct strike, miscalculation, or alliance commitments. Militias and proxy groups can activate their own fronts. Foreign bases become targets. Diplomacy gets pushed aside not because leaders do not mention it, but because events start moving faster than diplomatic channels can contain. A war does not need an official declaration to become regional. It only needs enough fear, enough pride, and enough momentum. Meanwhile, public opinion inside allied countries begins to shift under the weight of casualties, uncertainty, and moral outrage. Viral videos, emotional testimony, and angry speeches fuel arguments over why the war is being fought, who is benefiting, and who is paying the price. Some soldiers appear exhausted. Some families of military personnel question the purpose. Critics accuse leaders of using patriotism and alliance politics to justify decisions whose human cost is borne by ordinary people. Supporters argue that failure to respond decisively would only invite greater attacks later. In that atmosphere, every funeral becomes political, and every speech is judged against fresh images of destruction. Still, beyond all the strategy, the propaganda, and the analysis, the clearest truth remains painfully simple. The first victims of wars like this are not the men at podiums. They are the people hiding in stairwells, the children woken by sirens, the elderly who cannot run fast enough, the parents who try to sound calm while their voices shake. They are the families on both sides who lose homes, routines, and loved ones while leaders speak in the language of deterrence, sovereignty, and national honor. For civilians, war is never abstract. It is always local. It is always personal. It arrives as broken concrete, missed calls, emergency lights, and the unbearable wait for one more name to be answered. This is why the conflict now feels so heavy. It is no longer about one dramatic strike or one day of retaliation. It has become a rolling crisis, where each new attack deepens the belief that something larger is unfolding. People are no longer just reacting to explosions, they are reacting to the collapse of confidence. Confidence that defenses will hold, confidence that escalation has limits, confidence that tomorrow will be calmer than today. Once that confidence disappears, even moments of silence begin to feel temporary. And so the world keeps watching the same question grow more urgent with every fresh report from Tel Aviv, Haifa, Tehran, and beyond. Not who can claim victory in a statement, not who can post the strongest footage online, but who can stop this before the chain reaction becomes impossible to control. Because once war reaches the point where every response creates a harsher response, the real danger is not only what has already happened, it is what becomes thinkable next. That is the darkest shift of all. When cities burn long enough, the unthinkable stops feeling distant. It starts to look like the next step. For now, that is the shadow hanging over the region. A war of messages has become a war of endurance. A war of warnings has become a war of direct hits. And with every passing night, the distance between retaliation and catastrophe seems to grow thinner. The missiles may stop for an hour. The statements may pause for a day. But the fear remains, waiting above every rooftop, in every shelter, and inside every family wondering whether the next siren will be the one that changes everything.